What if one of the kindest gods in Greek mythology became one of the most feared, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented? That sounds backwards. After all, when most people hear the name Hades, they imagine darkness, punishment, and terror. His kingdom lies beneath the earth. His throne stands in the land of the dead. His name has become almost synonymous with fear itself. But here's the mystery: when you actually look at the role Hades plays in Greek mythology, something doesn't add up. Because unlike many of the Olympian gods, Hades is rarely driven by revenge, vanity, or reckless ambition. He does not spend his time interfering in every human decision. He does not wage endless wars for glory. He does not demand constant attention. Instead, he governs a realm that every mortal will eventually enter. Quietly. Consistently. Without favoritism. So why has history remembered him as a villain? That question matters more than it seems. Because this isn't really a story about a god. It's a story about us. Imagine a black throne standing in complete silence. No armies. No celebrations. No cheering crowds. Just a ruler presiding over a kingdom that no one wants to visit, yet no one can avoid. That image has survived for thousands of years because it touches something deeply uncomfortable in the human mind. Not evil. Not cruelty. Something else. A boundary. And human beings have always struggled with boundaries. We celebrate possibility. We admire growth. We chase more time, more success, more experiences. But there is one limit that refuses to negotiate with us. One reality that doesn't care how wealthy, powerful, intelligent, or beloved we become. Death. And this is where the contradiction begins. If Hades never controlled when people died, why do people associate him with death itself? If he was not the force ending human lives, why did he become the face of humanity's greatest fear? The answer may reveal something unsettling about the way people create monsters. Throughout history, when human beings encounter something they cannot defeat, they often give it a face. They turn an abstract reality into a character. They transform uncertainty into a figure they can blame, fear, or reject. In that sense, Hades may have become one of the oldest psychological mirrors ever created. Not a symbol of evil. A symbol of inevitability. And that changes everything. Because if Hades represents inevitability rather than cruelty, then his reputation tells us less about the god and more about the people who feared him. It suggests that our discomfort with mortality may have shaped the story far more than the mythology itself. The consequences of that idea reach far beyond ancient Greece. If a civilization fears death, it begins avoiding conversations about mortality. If individuals fear mortality, they begin avoiding conversations about meaning. And when people spend their lives running from the reality of an ending, they may also lose sight of what gives life value in the first place. Which raises a far bigger question. What if Hades was never the villain standing at the gates of the Underworld? What if he was simply the guardian of a truth that human beings have spent thousands of years trying not to face? Here is the deeper paradox. If Hades was feared because he ruled the realm of the dead, then we would expect every culture to fear every guardian of the afterlife in exactly the same way. But that isn't what we see. Across human history, civilizations have created countless figures associated with death, endings, and the world beyond life. Some were respected. Some were honored. Some were even viewed as guides. Yet again and again, one pattern emerges. The more a culture fears mortality, the more it begins to transform the symbols of mortality into symbols of evil. Why? Because there is a profound difference between understanding death and accepting it. Most people think fear begins when something threatens us. But some fears run deeper. Some fears exist not because they can harm us, but because they expose a truth we would rather avoid. And few truths are more difficult than this: every achievement, every possession, every title, every victory exists within a limited amount of time. That is where the conflict surrounding Hades becomes far more interesting. His kingdom was not built around chaos. It was built around order. Think about that for a moment. Olympus is filled with ambition, rivalry, desire, conflict, and constant change. Human life is filled with uncertainty. Empires rise and collapse. Families flourish and disappear. Entire civilizations believe they will last forever, only to become ruined studied centuries later. Yet beneath all of that movement lies a realm defined by permanence. A boundary. A final accounting. A place where status no longer negotiates with reality. And perhaps that is why one of the most powerful memory fragments in this story is not a weapon, not a battle, and not a monster. It is a silent throne. A ruler seated in darkness, not because he enjoys suffering, but because he governs the one domain where illusion no longer matters. That image creates another contradiction. Human beings often claim they want truth. We celebrate honesty. We admire wisdom. We praise those who face reality. But do we? Because mortality may be the ultimate reality. And throughout history, people have spent extraordinary amounts of energy avoiding it. Some seek distractions. Some chase endless accumulation. Some become obsessed with legacy. Others convince themselves that endings are problems to be solved rather than conditions to be understood. The consequence is subtle but enormous. When people refuse to confront mortality, they begin misunderstanding life itself. Because meaning and limitation are connected. A song matters because it ends. A season matters because it passes. A relationship matters because it cannot be guaranteed forever. Without limits, value begins to dissolve. And suddenly Hades starts looking very different. Not as the enemy of life, but as the guardian of the boundary that gives life significance. Yet another mystery appears. If Hades represented order, and if order gives meaning to existence, why did ancient people rarely speak his name directly? Why was there such caution surrounding him? Why did even those who respected cosmic balance often hesitate when confronting the ruler of the underworld? The answer cannot simply be fear. Fear alone is too small an explanation. Something deeper was happening. Because the closer people moved toward understanding Hades, the closer they moved toward understanding themselves. And perhaps that was the greater discomfort. Not the existence of death, but the realization that every life is being measured against a horizon it cannot cross. Which raises an even more unsettling possibility. What if Hades' reputation was never shaped primarily by what happened in the underworld at all? What if it was shaped by what happened inside the human mind whenever it encountered a limit it could not overcome? If the human mind turns unavoidable realities into enemies, then a troubling question emerges. Was Hades feared because people misunderstood him? Or was he feared because people understood him too well? That distinction changes everything. Up to this point, we have been looking at the relationship between mortality and perception. But beneath that relationship lies a deeper conflict, one that reaches far beyond mythology. The conflict is not between life and death. It is between what human beings want reality to be and what reality actually is. Most myths are filled with struggle. Heroes challenge monsters. Kings challenge fate. Nations challenge chaos. The underlying assumption is always the same: if you are strong enough, wise enough, or brave enough, you can change the outcome. Hades stands outside that framework. That is what makes him so unusual. He is not the obstacle that must be defeated. He is the reminder that some boundaries cannot be negotiated. And that creates a contradiction that many people instinctively resist. Human beings admire power. We celebrate individuals who overcome limitations. We tell stories about breaking barriers and rewriting rules. Entire civilizations are built around the promise of expansion, growth, and progress. But what happens when we encounter something that does not respond to effort? What happens when determination, wealth, status, and intelligence all arrive at the same destination? Suddenly, the values that organize everyday life begin to lose their hierarchy. In front of ultimate limits, emperors and farmers stand closer together than either would like to admit. That is not merely a mythological observation. It is a civilizational one. And here the crisis begins to deepen. Because many societies do not simply fear mortality. They organize themselves around avoiding awareness of it. Think about the modern world. Entire industries are devoted to preserving youth. Endless streams of entertainment help people avoid silence. Productivity becomes a substitute for reflection. Achievement becomes a substitute for meaning. None of these things are inherently wrong. But together they reveal something fascinating. The more powerful a civilization becomes, the more tempted it may be to believe that every problem can eventually be solved. Every problem except one. That creates a tension that never fully disappears. And in that tension, symbols begin to change. The silent throne in the underworld no longer represents cosmic order. It becomes a threat to the illusion of total control. The river becomes more than a boundary. It becomes a reminder. The guardian at the gate becomes more than a protector. It becomes a witness. These are not merely mythological images. They are psychological pressure points. Memory fragments left behind by generations attempting to grapple with the same question. What do we do with a truth that refuses to change? Now another contradiction emerges. If Hades truly represented oppression, rebellion against him would make sense. But mythology rarely presents him as a tyrant obsessed with domination. Instead, he appears as a ruler whose authority comes from permanence rather than ambition. That difference is subtle. Yet it may explain why his legacy has endured for thousands of years. People can fight a tyrant. People can overthrow a king. People can reject an ideology. But how do you resist a condition of existence itself? This is where the fear surrounding Hades begins to transform into something else. Not fear of punishment. Not fear of darkness. Fear of limitation. And perhaps that is the hidden crisis at the center of the entire story. Because if human beings are uncomfortable with limits, then Hades is not merely a figure from mythology. He is a mirror reflecting a permanent tension within the human condition. But that realization opens an even greater mystery. If Hades was never the source of the fear, and was only the symbol that absorbed it, then who, or what, was the real author of his terrifying reputation? Here is the revelation that begins to reshape the entire picture. The figure sitting on that silent throne was never primarily a symbol of death. He was a symbol of balance. And those are not the same thing. Death is an event. Balance is a principle. Death happens to individuals. Balance governs worlds. That distinction may explain why the ruler of the underworld occupies such a unique place in Greek thought. Most powers in mythology seek expansion. They pursue influence, territory, recognition, devotion. Their stories are driven by movement. But the role of Hades is different. His authority does not come from conquest. It comes from containment. He is the keeper of a boundary that allows every other part of existence to function. Consider one of the most overlooked symbols associated with the underworld, the gate. A gate exists for a very specific reason. It separates one condition from another. It preserves order on both sides. Without boundaries, there is no structure. Without structure, there is no meaning. Suddenly the image of Cerberus standing watch becomes something more than a mythical creature. He is a memory fragment of a larger idea. Not a monster guarding punishment, but a guardian preserving distinction. The living remain among the living. The dead remain among the dead. The system endures because the boundary endures. This leads to a deeper insight. Human beings often assume compassion means removing limits. Yet many of the most important forms of order depend upon limits being maintained. A river without banks becomes a flood. A society without laws becomes instability. A life without endings becomes something difficult to value. In that sense, the underworld represents a principle that extends far beyond mythology. It represents the architecture of consequence. Every choice eventually arrives somewhere. Every action creates a result. Every life moves toward an endpoint that gives shape to everything that came before it. This is why the Black Throne remains such a powerful image. Not because it represents fear, but because it represents accountability to reality itself. And here another layer of the contradiction begins to reveal itself. Modern culture often frames freedom as the absence of constraints. The wider the options, the greater the freedom. The fewer the limits, the better the life. But ancient myths repeatedly suggest something different. They suggest that limits are not merely restrictions. They are the framework that makes purpose possible. Remove all boundaries, and direction disappears. Remove all consequences, and meaning weakens. Remove all endings, and urgency evaporates. The influence of this idea reaches far beyond one mythological figure. Entire civilizations struggle with the tension between permanence and limitation. Entire generations wrestle with the question of whether human progress can eventually eliminate every boundary. Yet beneath every technological achievement, every social transformation, and every cultural revolution remains the same unchanging reality: some limits are structural. Some boundaries define the system itself. And perhaps that is why the ruler of the underworld has remained psychologically relevant for thousands of years. Not because people fear his kingdom, but because his kingdom represents a truth that continues to challenge human assumptions. The truth that meaning may depend upon limitation rather than freedom alone. But if that is true, then an even more unsettling possibility emerges. What if the greatest misunderstanding was not seeing Hades as evil? What if the greatest misunderstanding was failing to recognize what his existence was actually protecting? If the ruler of the underworld was protecting something rather than threatening it, then we arrive at the central question of the entire journey: what exactly was being protected? The answer is not a kingdom. It is not a gate. It is not even the boundary between life and death. The deepest revelation is far more surprising. What Hades ultimately protects is meaning itself. This is the insight that often disappears beneath centuries of fear, symbolism, and misunderstanding. Most people see mortality as the thing that takes meaning away. Greek mythology quietly suggests the opposite. Mortality is what creates meaning in the first place. Think about how human beings experience value. We treasure moments because they pass. We cherish relationships because they are fragile. We make choices because time is limited. Remove limitation, and something unexpected happens. Urgency begins to fade. Priorities become blurred. Decisions lose weight. Meaning does not expand forever. It starts to dissolve. Suddenly the silent architecture of the underworld appears in a completely different light. The throne. The river. The gate. The guardian. None of these symbols exist merely to represent an ending. Together they form a system that reminds humanity of a fundamental truth: every meaningful thing exists within a boundary. This transforms the role of Hades completely. His influence is not centered on death. It is centered on significance. His contradiction becomes clearer than ever. He is feared as a destroyer while functioning as a preserver. He is remembered as a symbol of loss while embodying the condition that allows value to exist. He appears at the edge of life, yet his role shapes how life itself is experienced. That is why his legacy extends beyond mythology. Every civilization faces the same tension. Every generation must answer the same question. How do we live knowing our time is finite? Some cultures answer through achievement. Others through faith. Others through family, service, creativity, or legacy. But beneath every answer lies the same invisible foundation: limitation. The consequences of forgetting this are profound. When people believe there will always be more time, priorities drift. When societies become obsessed with avoiding every reminder of mortality, they often become disconnected from deeper questions of purpose. When individuals spend their lives treating limits as enemies, they may never discover the value those limits were creating all along. Here another memory fragment emerges. Imagine standing beside a river that cannot be crossed twice in the same way. Not because the river changes, but because you do. Every year of life alters the person approaching the boundary. Every decision shapes the journey. The river is not merely a symbol of ending. It is a symbol of irreversibility. And irreversibility is what gives consequence its power. This may be the deepest philosophical layer hidden within the story. The opposite of meaninglessness is not immortality. The opposite of meaninglessness is consequence. Actions matter because they cannot be endlessly undone. Time matters because it moves in one direction. Life matters because it is finite. Seen from this perspective, the ruler of the underworld becomes less like a supernatural figure and more like a guardian of reality's structure itself. Yet this revelation creates a consequence that is even larger than the myth. If meaning depends upon limitation, and limitation depends upon consequence, then what happens to a society that spends all its energy trying to escape every limit, avoid every consequence, and forget every reminder of mortality? Would such a civilization become freer, or would it slowly lose the very thing that gives life its meaning? The consequences of this idea reach much farther than a single mythological figure. Once you begin to see the ruler of the underworld as a guardian of consequence rather than a symbol of malice, an uncomfortable realization follows. The real danger was never misunderstanding a god. The real danger was misunderstanding the relationship between limitation and meaning. Every civilization leaves behind clues about what it fears most. Some build monuments to victory. Some preserve stories of heroes. Some dedicate enormous effort to preserving youth, wealth, status, or influence. Yet beneath all of these ambitions lies the same silent reality represented by one of the most enduring memory fragments in this story, a throne that does not need to pursue power because its authority does not depend on recognition. That image contains a lesson that extends across centuries. Human systems change. Governments rise and fall. Technologies transform daily life. Cultural values evolve. But consequence remains. Actions still produce results. Choices still shape futures. Time still moves forward. The deeper legacy of the underworld is not death itself. It is accountability to reality. This becomes especially important when we look at the modern world. Many people live surrounded by constant stimulation. Information never stops. Entertainment never ends. New opportunities appear every day. The result is a subtle illusion that life is endlessly expandable. That there will always be more time. More chances. More tomorrows. Yet the psychological cost of that illusion can be surprisingly high. When people stop feeling the weight of limitation, they often struggle to identify what truly matters. Priorities become scattered. Meaning becomes fragmented. Urgency turns into distraction. The consequence is not necessarily unhappiness. It is something more difficult to recognize. A gradual erosion of significance. This is where the legacy of Hades becomes unexpectedly relevant. Not as a religious figure. Not as a supernatural ruler. But as a symbolic reminder that boundaries create clarity. Consider another powerful memory fragment. A gate standing between worlds. Most people focus on what the gate prevents. Fewer people focus on what it protects. Boundaries preserve identity. They define relationships. They create distinction. Without them, categories collapse into confusion. The same principle applies to individual lives. Personal values matter because some choices are rejected. Commitments matter because alternatives are surrendered. Purpose matters because time cannot be spent everywhere at once. Every meaningful life is shaped not only by what is embraced, but also by what is left behind. That insight scales upward. Families are shaped by priorities. Communities are shaped by shared limits. Civilizations are shaped by what they choose to honor and what they choose to ignore. The influence of consequence extends from the individual to the collective, from a single decision to the trajectory of history itself. And perhaps that explains why this ancient figure continues to endure in cultural memory. Not because people are fascinated by endings, but because endings reveal what was important all along. Yet one mystery remains unresolved. If consequence gives meaning to life, and if limitation gives consequence its power, why do human beings spend so much energy trying to escape the very conditions that make life meaningful in the first place? And more importantly, what happens when an entire civilization succeeds in forgetting that truth? Perhaps that is why this ancient figure continues to endure long after the temples disappeared, long after the rituals faded, and long after the people who first told these stories were gone. The lasting power of the underworld was never rooted in fear. It was rooted in recognition. Somewhere beneath every generation's ambitions, anxieties, and distractions lies the same quiet awareness that life gains its shape from things that cannot be controlled. In the end, the most memorable image is not a god. It is a landscape of symbols. A silent throne that does not need admiration. A river that cannot be negotiated with. A gate that separates one condition of existence from another. A guardian who stands watch not over punishment, but over permanence. These memory fragments remain powerful because they point toward something larger than mythology. They point toward a question every human being eventually encounters. What gives a life weight? Modern culture offers many answers. Achievement. Recognition. Wealth. Influence. Experience. Yet all of these answers remain incomplete because they focus on what is accumulated rather than what is understood. The deeper lesson hidden beneath the story is that meaning is not created solely by what we gain. Meaning is also shaped by what we accept. There is a profound difference between possessing more and understanding enough. That distinction may explain why so many people feel restless even in periods of abundance. Human beings are remarkably skilled at expanding possibilities. We build larger systems, create new technologies, and extend the boundaries of what seems achievable. Yet the most important questions often remain unchanged. How should we spend our time? What deserves our attention? What is worth sacrificing for? What kind of life remains valuable when stripped of status, applause, and distraction? The ruler of the underworld endures as a symbolic answer to none of these questions and a challenge to all of them. His role was never to provide comfort. His role was to preserve perspective. In that sense, his legacy is not about death. It is about proportion. He reminds us that every choice exists within a larger horizon. Every priority is measured against a finite span of years. Every moment becomes meaningful because it cannot be repeated forever. Seen from this angle, the story transforms one final time. The figure sitting in darkness is no longer standing opposite life. He is standing behind it, giving it definition. Just as a frame gives shape to a painting, limitations give shape to existence. Remove the frame, and the image begins to lose coherence. Remove the horizon, and direction becomes difficult to find. Remove consequence, and significance gradually fades away. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is not why people feared the ruler of the underworld. Perhaps the real mystery is why humanity so often resists the very realities that make love meaningful, choices important, memories precious, and life itself worth living. And if the boundaries we spend our lives trying to escape are also the boundaries that give our lives meaning, then what is the greater illusion, mortality itself, or the belief that a meaningful life could exist without it?